on the AP exam. The other thing I want to say is please try to subscribe to our AP Live reviews. That helps us as well. And like us if you're liking us.
All right, so we're starting in those cobblestone streets that Todd was talking about during the opening. And I want you to take a look at the beautiful picture of Florence that you can see on the screen there as we move in to talk about the historical development that is on the right-hand side. So Italian Renaissance humanists, including Petrarch, promoted a revival in classical literature and created new philological approaches to ancient texts. Some Renaissance humanists furthered the values of secularism and individualism. All right, next slide, Todd. Thank you. There's Petrarch. And so the Renaissance is characterized by a deep interest in looking back at ancient Greek and Roman literature and philosophy, from which new ideas about humans and human nature were developed. And this interest in the classical past began in the 14th century with Petrarch. And you can see him there on the right. He believed that he was living in a new era where writers and artists would bring forward the glory of a classical past. He advocated for a kind of classical scholarship that would become the intellectual centerpiece for the Renaissance called humanism. This program of study emphasized the critical study of Latin and Greek literature, while it valued the worthiness of human nature and human accomplishments. So really important to see that word human in humanism. It's really central to understanding. Along with promoting a revival in classical texts, some Renaissance humanists furthered the values of secularism and individualism, and these values are closely intertwined with humanism. Humanists focused their attention on the present and less on the afterlife that was so important during the Middle Ages, so very secular, worldly. And similarly, individualism becomes a prominent theme in Italy. Philosophers wrote about the potential of man and developed their own beliefs on the kind of person an individual should aim to be. All right, so that brings us to another historical development. And that is that the admiration for Greek and Roman political institutions supported a revival of civic humanist culture in the Italian city-states and produced secular models for individual and for political behavior. So let's look at some examples of those. So before we start, you can see there's this portrait. We're going to talk in a minute about Castiglione, but this is a portrait by Raphael. And when I started the year, and I know for many of you, this feels like a long time ago. You probably covered the Renaissance back in August or September. So this feels very far away. So you have a lot of review to do. And so we want to take a minute and talk about the fact that Todd and I are not going to cover all of the topics in unit 1 or 2, and in fact, in any of the units over our next 2 weeks together. So please know that we've kind of hit some highlights from each unit. But for example, this is one of, I tell my students at the beginning of the year, the so-called Ninja Turtles from Italian Renaissance art. And we're not going to cover that in our lesson today. But there are AP daily videos that you can absolutely go back and look at if you need a reminder, a review of the different content. Not only the things that Todd and I cover, but also the things that we're not going to cover. All right. So as we're looking kind of contextualizing these models of behavior, for much of the Renaissance, the powerful Medici family ruled Florence from behind the scenes. Lorenzo the Magnificent was known as an advocate of civic humanism. These ideas were from ancient Greece, and civic humanism was the belief that it was an intellectual civic duty to be involved in politics and to help the community. So civic humanism is a very active concept you have to do in your community. All right, so examples of these models, and I just picked a couple for individual and political behavior that I like to cover with my students. Your teachers might have done something different, but here we have Castiglione, and one example for a secular model for individual behavior can be found in his book of the Courtier. This was a training manual of sorts for the ideal gentleman, as well as a how-to book for someone wanting to climb socially. It described the broad academic background a gentleman should have, along with physical fitness and skills in many disciplines like music, math, and dance. It was translated into many languages, widely read throughout Europe. It was a bestseller, and Castiglione gets his portrait painted by Raphael there on the right. And then I'm sure many of you might remember from the beginning of the year talking about Machiavelli's The Prince. It's really the best example for a model of political behavior. In it, he used classical and current examples to argue about the qualities needed for effective rulers. And he, after personally living through the power struggles in Florence for over 2 decades. So these are not the only examples that your teachers might have kind of covered with you, but I wanted to give you a couple of examples that matched what the course and exam description wanted you to know, those must-know things. All right, so the Italian Renaissance moves to the north. And so I want you to kind of have us look together at this idea of Christian humanism, which was embodied in the writings of Erasmus, employed Renaissance learning in the service of religious reform. Actually, Todd, I'm going to have you go back really quickly. I don't know why that circle was there. So if you guys will just follow along with me at the one on the top, we'll come back to the other concept there. So we have the Northern Renaissance that retains a more religious focus. The Northern Renaissance, I want you to see some continuities and changes. And that results in a more human-centered naturalism that considers individuals and everyday life appropriate objects of artistic representation. So sorry about that. We'll come back to Christian humanism in just a minute. And Todd, if you'll go to the next slide, I've done a chart to kind of do continuities and changes between Italian Renaissance art and Northern Renaissance art. So, and then if you look really quickly on the right, you see that if you're looking for some examples of this art, these are the AP Daily videos you can check out. If this is just feeling like it was really far away in the course, then you want a little specific information. So first, who's paying for the art? In the Italian Renaissance, we have the Catholic Church that's paying for the art. Wealthy aristocratic families like the Medicis are paying for the art. And as we move to the north, we have wealthy merchants and monarchs that are our big patrons, the people who pay for the artists to do their work. As we move down, we look at what's being depicted in the art. And we definitely see some changes as we move from Italy into the north. Italy has very classical figures from mythology in ancient Greece and Rome, as well as religious figures and scenes. And as we move to the north, we see a huge shift. We see peasants, normal people in their everyday lives. We see portraits and nature, domestic interiors, and we see fewer nudes than we saw during the Italian Renaissance. Continuing on, we look at the materials and focus of the art. So it makes sense that in Italy, we have the things that are easily found. We have fresco paints, we have tempera paints, as well as marble. Marble is plentiful in Italy, and as we move to the north, it's not plentiful. So we're gonna see other mediums, oil on panel and wood, and a shift from a focus on scientific principles like proportion, anatomy, and perspective into a focus on color and detail. However, there are continuities. There are some things that stay the same. And so if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, we definitely continue with religious subject matters. Both Italian and Northern Renaissance art use perspective, and we have the employing of naturalism and realism in both of the art movements. All right, and our last one, sorry, now we're here at Christian humanism, hopefully. So Christian humanism, again, employs religious learning in the service, Renaissance learning in the service of religious reform. So as we look at this last slide for the Renaissance, we'll start with Thomas More. He's an English humanist, and he wrote Utopia in 1516. And in this, he describes an island outside of Europe where all children receive an education in the Greek and Roman classics, and where problems such as poverty and discord have been solved by the government. There is religious toleration and no dissent or disagreement. So that's where we get that word utopia, right? Or a perfect society. And this is how this humanist envisioned that, a combination of religious toleration and ancient Greek and Roman ideals. And then we get to the person mentioned in that key concept, and that's Erasmus. He's known as the Prince of Humanists. He's the most famous of the Northern humanists, and he becomes a famous reformer. He wants to unite the classical ideals that were important in Italy, like humanism and civic virtue, with Christian ideas from the Bible, such as love and piety. He wanted to look not only to classical sources, but also to ancient original Christian sources from church fathers. So Erasmus creates a Greek version of the New Testament and a very famous satire that criticized religious and political institutions in his The Praise of Folly. He believes that education was the key to all reform and that his church had strayed from the ideals it should have been following. And he also created a new Latin translation of the New Testament, actually in 1516, the same year that Thomas More wrote Utopia. So we have a quote here at the end. And I actually don't know who this quote is attributed to. Maybe Todd knows, but it's kind of one that we talk about when we're in class, and maybe your teacher used it with you, that Erasmus laid the egg and Martin Luther hatched it. This idea that Erasmus begins in The Praise of Folly, sort of criticizing religious and political institutions, and Martin Luther kind of just grabs it and runs with it. So I think that hands it off to Todd to talk a little bit about the Protestant Reformation.
I am aware of the quote, but I am not sure who the quote should be attributed to. Okay, so here we're going to shift over to the age of Reformation. And I want to talk about how and why these religious beliefs and practices changed from 1450 to 1648. So that's period one in European history. And we're looking at, what's going on currently, and then how does this change? And we're going to talk about some of these reformers. So Martin Luther, John Calvin are going to be some of the reformers we talk about. You may have also learned about some of the Anabaptists as well. There's that. And now, so let's go talk about, as we get into this period of reform, what is the church like as we head into this? So the condition of the church, and we think about different historical thinking skills, we're talking about contextualization. So in the early 16th century, the Catholic Church is the center of life for all social classes throughout Europe. And most people were deeply pious, that is, deeply faithful, religiously regular, if you will, attending to religious study and doing things that they felt would help them enter heaven when that day came for them. A wide range of people had grievances, and that's a word that means I have issues, I have concerns with the church. And educated lay people such as Christian humanists, who Kay just mentioned, and urban residents, villagers and artisans, and some church officials want some type of reform. So reform meaning change. We recognize this is our church, but we also would like to see some things get better that are going on. And there are some things that we're going to point to that we don't think are good. So some of the signs and disorder and abuse in the Catholic Church at this time include clerical immorality. That is, we have a bunch of clerics throughout the country, and some of them aren't behaving like we expect clerics to behave. Clerical ignorance. One of the things you have to look at is kind of a cause-effect relationship here, because in the period prior to this, we've got the Black Death, the plague spreading throughout Europe. And those attending to those who were sick are clerics and nuns. And because they were attending to them, they also became sick and passed away. And what were needed then, the church had to kind of hurry up the education, if you will, of number of clerics and nuns and get them out to minister to the people. And in doing so, they were not ready. So there's kind of this idea of clerical ignorance. There's a lot of historical records of clerics supposedly saying the Mass in Latin, but they're mumbling through it and it's not Latin. And so that's a concern that people have. There's absenteeism and pluralism. And those two words are like you think they would be. Absenteeism meaning if I'm assigned to this area and I'm not showing up, that's one of them. And then pluralism meaning if I'm assigned to one area, but I'm also assigned to another, and I'm taking wages, I guess, if you will, from those two dioceses, if you will, that was also really, really frowned upon, and they felt that something wasn't quite kosher on the up and up with that. There are also privileges. So as clerics, you're not, the church doesn't have to pay taxes necessarily. They might pay an annual tithe to the king, depending on the land, but they have a lot of privileges that everyday common people in these villages and throughout Europe don't have. And so some see that as an abuse that they want to have remedied in some way. So this image you're looking at is of Pope Julius II, and you see the dates till 1513. He held the office of Pope until his death. And so he's kind of the one dealing, supposedly having to deal with some of these changes that the church is going through. Now we're going to talk about a man named Martin Luther, and we're going to talk quickly about the illustration. This is a Dominican preacher, Johann Tetzel, selling indulgences inside a church. So indulgences is kind of a central theme of Luther's change and Reformation and push. And so this is an image I thought was pretty good because most of the images of Tetzel I've seen aren't quite within this, but you see this line of faithful coming through. You see the man putting coins on a table, receiving a script or a piece of paper, telling him they're going to be absolved of these particular sins. So Martin Luther is an Augustinian monk who, through his study of the New Testament, came to believe that salvation is obtained by faith alone. And he believed that scriptures revealed God to people, not the traditions of the Catholic Church. This is really an important topic here because Luther was a Catholic monk and he was doing all these things to try and make sure that he wanted to assurances that he would be saved, that he would have salvation. And none of these things that he was attempting to never really felt like it's going to ever be enough. And he's looking through the letters of St. Paul, and it comes to him that really it's about making sure that I am faithful to God. And if I am faithful to God, then I am going to receive salvation. And because he says that, he says it's really scripture reveals God's to people, not these traditions and different things that are going on within the church itself. And you can think that that's going to feel threatening if you're the church. So during his time, Pope Leo X then is going to authorize a special indulgence. And you can see them collecting money here. And that indulgence is to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This is a big project that's going on as a part of the Renaissance. And so in German states, these sales were run by the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel, who promised that the purchase of the indulgence would bring full forgiveness of one's sins or the sins of a loved one from purgatory. And he famously said, when a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. So it's like a modern day marketing campaign to help use the money to help build this magnificent cathedral that becomes St. Peter's in Rome. And so here you have this image, and it's the first time I've seen this image. I kind of collected it and I was like, I kind of like it. It's a little cartoonish, but you see the anxiety on Luther's face as he's nailing the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg in Germany, and the concern of the onlookers, if you will. So I was kind of attracted to the animation of the image itself. So this is deeply troubling. The idea of indulgences is deeply troubling to Luther. And so he wrote these 95 Theses, these different arguments or grievances that he has, the things that he believes, claims that he thinks should happen to reform the church. And he taxed them to the stories. He taxed them to the church door at Wittenberg on October 31st on All Hallows Eve in 1517. They're quickly printed in both Latin and Germany and widely disseminated. Yes, the printing press plays a role in spreading this information. Luther continues to write, urging reforms in the church. His works were quickly condemned by Rome, and he is threatened with excommunication. This is something that's very, very serious, especially in this time. And so in 1521, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time was Charles V. He is a Habsburg, and he's going to call a diet or an assembly of notable. A diet is like a big meeting in the city of Worms in Germany, and he calls Luther to appear. And Luther does appear, and he has the debate, and he refuses to recant the arguments that he's been making in the 95 Theses. And after the Diet of Worms, the religious division in German states continued, and Charles V is going to agree eventually, after a great deal of, we're walking through this rather quickly, he'll eventually agree to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which officially recognizes Protestantism, and it's going to allow the German princes of those lands to choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism. One thing to keep in mind, and this is a big deal because there are almost 400 different principalities throughout the German lands. And so each German prince then gets to choose which type of faith they want to follow. And there's an economic aspect to that decision as well. All right. So let's talk about further reformers. And I have a map for you. I know it's really busy and the legend at the top is really small, but really the big picture look here is, do we see change occurring in Europe? Okay. So all these different colors represent different types of reform that are taking place in Europe that were Catholic. Okay. And so You're seeing kind of this purplish, it's a mixed in Bohemia and Austria, a mix of Catholic and Protestant areas. This darker purple in Switzerland is mostly Calvinist. We're going to read it. We're going to talk quickly about John Calvin and the changes he made in Geneva, Switzerland. This kind of orangish, salmony color is mostly Lutheran, turning to Lutheranism. And the yellows are kind of the areas that stay the same, stay Catholic. And these purples are, again, a mix that you see in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, you got the northern part is going Lutheran, the southern part is remaining Catholic. Those are lands held by the Habsburgs. And then you see the Scandinavian countries all switch to Lutheranism. So the map is really intended to show you this big sweeping change that's occurring throughout. So the first area outside of Germany to officially accept the Reformation is the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, under King Christian III. And so while the process of conversion went smoothly and quickly in Denmark, it happened gradually, more gradually in Norway and in Iceland because of some resistance from the people. In Sweden, it's Gustavus Vasa, who helps bring Protestantism into the region. And then proceeding from the idea of God's absolute sovereignty, you have, and God's omnipotence, you have John Calvin, another reformer, who concludes a little differently than Luther. He says human beings could do nothing to save themselves, whereas Luther said, you know, if I'm reading scripture and I can do that, and that will help me get into the good place. God decides at the beginning of time who's going to be saved is what Calvin believed, and that is the idea of predestination. Calvin and his city government of Geneva in Switzerland attempt to regulate people's conduct in order to create a godly city on earth. And so it is kind of done by the thinking of scripture and by the government itself. And so they ban card playing, dancing, any other forms of recreational activity. So it's a very rigid look at how the people behave in the city of Geneva. And another reformer, Knox, who studied with Calvin in Geneva, he's instrumental in creating the Scottish Parliament to set up a Calvinist church as the official state church of Scotland, which becomes more known as Presbyterian. So we look over at the map and you can see that kind of mostly Calvinist, dark, that lighter lavender purple is how Scotland turns. And again, the idea is to see this big sweeping sets of changes and reforms that are happening within a very short period of time, actually, throughout the 15th century.
All right.
All right.
So let's review. And actually, before we start talking about the SAQ, I just want to remind again, if you notice the country that was in pink, we didn't even talk about the English Reformation. So to remind you that there's so much that we're not able to cover. And so Henry VIII, and I am sure usually my students, I think, really like the Anglican Reformation, the English Reformation. So we are not covering everything about the Protestant Reformation in this quick blurb that we went through. And Todd hit it. We danced through it very, very quickly.